Welcome back to Let's Talk Water New Mexico. This is episode number 2, and you are here with your hosts, Evan Lamoureux and Liz Jolly. This is a series of 6 podcasts coordinated and hosted by the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium. The consortium is a collaborative effort between government, academia, and public and private companies to research and support the use of treated water as a new source of water supply for New Mexico. The consortium is ultimately looking to solve New Mexico's water challenges through innovation and collaboration.
Well, thanks, Evan. Let's take a moment and step back and recap what we talked about last episode. This is where we had John D'Antonio and Dave Dubois in the episode, and we spent a lot of time talking about water supply and demand in not just New Mexico, but also in the Southwest.
Yeah, John and Dave did a great job highlighting the impact that has intensified drought and climate change we're having in New Mexico, specifically on the supply and demand. They talked about how the changing climate is exacerbating the problem by warming temperatures and ultimately reducing New Mexico's precipitation. It was clear by the end of the first podcast that our historical water supply availability may diminish by as much as 15 to 25% in the next 50 years. What we want to do now is talk a bit about produced water and how it might be a part of the solution here in New Mexico.
Before we go any further, we need to introduce our special guests for the discussion today. We have with us Mike Hightower, Rick McCurdy, and Dave Burnett. Will you guys please briefly introduce yourselves to our listeners? Dave, let's start with you.
I am David Burnett. I'm a retired research scientist, chemist, a trained reservoir engineer in Texaco. Give you an idea of how long I've been around. I'm a 50-year member of the Society of Petroleum Engineers. I've been doing produced water treatment for the last 25 years and a specialist in membrane technology. In the past, I worked with Dr. Jerry Sullivan, Los Alamos Labs, when they were looking at produced water too. She and I had a small field lab test in the San Juan Basin, and that got Los Alamos started, and it got me going. Since then, I've gone to probably 6 of the 7 major shale plays.
Thank you, Dave. Rick, let's go to you next and share a bit about yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to know that I'm very proud or very lucky to be part of the conversation here today. As mentioned, my name is Rick McCurdy. I currently serve as Vice President of Innovation and Sustainability for Select Energy Services. I have a 42-year industry veteran in the oil and gas industry, and for practically all of that career, I have worked around produced water in some format. For the last 15 years, I have been a very strong advocate of the use of produced water within oil and gas operations as a substitute for fresh water, and also for the potential treatment of produced water for some recovery of fresh water out of that volume. As such, I've spoken in numerous locations, both locally and on a national level toward that end. I've been a part of the Produced Water Consortium since it was stood up in New Mexico, and represent Select Energy on that consortium as well. Now, the actual, if you look at the group of folks that have been involved with this strong look at produced water for the last 10, 15 years, it's a very small family to some extent. And as such, I've had the pleasure of knowing both David and Mike for many years now.
And last but definitely not least, Mike, please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Mike Hightower. I'm currently the director of the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium. I recently retired from Sandia National Laboratories, where I worked for about 40 years on national security issues. In the last 20 years, specifically around national security issues relative to water and energy. So I've worked for the last, since about 2000, on issues around water energy considerations, and that includes produced water treatment and reuse, water supplies for electric power generation, biofuels, hydrogen development, etc. So I also worked with the Bureau of Reclamation and the US EPA on developing a national desalination research roadmap in the early 2000s, and helped the Bureau of Reclamation develop the Brackish Groundwater National Desalination Research Facility in Alamogordo, New Mexico.
Well, thank you, Mike, Rick, and Dave. We really appreciate your background. It helps us not only dig into your experience, but also your expertise as we talk more about treated produced water. And as Evan mentioned, the discussion for today is going to center around produced water as a part of the solution to the water challenges in New Mexico and throughout the Southwest.
Well, let's dive into our conversation. Let's first start with a hopefully easy and simple question. We'll throw this to you, Mike. Can you give us a definition of treated produced water? What exactly are we talking about? Just want to make sure we're all on the same page as we're diving in.
Sure, happy to do that. There's a lot of definitions of produced water. I like to use the definition by the US EPA, and essentially they define produced water as the fluid brought up from the hydrocarbon bearing strata during the extraction of oil and gas. So with that definition, that includes then formation water, where the produced water sits in the strata. It includes water that was used for drilling. It would use water that was used for completion of the well. It would include water that was used for hydraulic fracking. So produced water, by their definition, and I think that's the definition that most states use, includes all the water that is brought up during oil and gas production and development processes. That water depends upon the formation that it's in, but it has a lot of constituents. So it has salts because a lot of these formations are former seabed sediments. So you've got salts, you have minerals from the formation, the geologic formation. Then you have chemicals that may have been introduced into the drilling and production process, as well as then the water that's developed has been in contact with oils and natural gas. And so there are oils that have to be looked at. So when we look at the term treated produced water, then it's the produced water that has those constituents then that is treated to try to remove those constituents so that we can use that water for different purposes.
Thank you for that definition, Mike. That's really helpful for our discussion today. So based on the introductions that you guys gave, it looks like produced water is not a new concept or a new idea in terms of using it as another source, and it's been around a while. Can we walk through a bit of the history around produced water? Dave, will you get us started?
Certainly. Let's take us back to 1976, the energy crisis. Shows you how far back I'm going to take you. Actually, produced water is produced along with oil and gas. So ever since the Drake well and the Spindletop, we've had produced water. Oil and gas people have tried to handle it, condition it, and for the most part, you can put that water back into the formation where it came. What really broke everything open, obviously, was the shale, the advent of the shale. But way back in the 60s, they were looking at the Permian Basin, drilled up in the 1950s, 60s, and in New Mexico. And they had early tests in the Kelly Snyder field doing CO2 injection, and the water was giving them problems. And that's how I got started in it. Produced water is with regular oil and gas production. If you're in kind of a rock formation Mike was talking about, sandstones and dolomites and fractured things, the water can be injected back in. In fact, it's necessary to maintain pressure. There are contaminants you've got to remove. Los Alamos was looking at some of those. But for the most part, oil and gas people knew how to handle the water. Maybe 10,000 gallons of water was used for a fracture. Earl Halliburton did the first fracturing, and that's where water started being used in a productive manner back in the 40s. So that was pretty cool. And so I would say back in around 2000, Mike got started and I got started. Mitchell Energy, George Mitchell, kept working in the Barnett Shale, West Fort Worth Basin. Finally got a well to be production to pay more money back than what it got. The Barnett Shale was born. And the solution was use a large amount of water to just fracture the bejabbers out of it. So you went immediately from 10,000 gallons to 100,000 gallons, and it began to grow. Then horizontal wells began to be productive and being able to handle them, and the independents, the drilling crews could do those. Austin Chalk was early developer, using horizontal wells to encounter the fractures in the chalk.
So it sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, produced water has been around since oil and gas, but up until kind of recent history, it was always viewed as just a byproduct and not really the purpose of reusing it. And the shale revolution is where that was kind of changed the paradigm and, started to bring about the look of how can we use what's coming back.
All right. So Dave mentioned early years in the Barnett Shale. And so we started to see involvement there. We started seeing treatment of produced water there, primarily due to the fact that in the late 2000s, North Texas, like New Mexico and West Texas, was in a strong drought. And the particular additives that we used with hydraulic fracturing in time, the chemical additives, only worked with fresh water. And there was an operator in the Barnett whose acreage was outside of the area to where any fresh groundwater was available. And so in order to actually go after and complete that acreage and produce gas off of it, they had to come up with a way to have fresh water available. They did this by employing a technology that was literally a still, and they would take the produced water and treat it through this technology. They would capture the steam, and then they would use that condensed steam, fresh water, in their ongoing hydraulic fracturing operations, and that's how they were able to continue producing gas out of the Barnett Shale. That's not the only instance. There's instances up in the coal bed methane, up in the Powder River Basin where they took the water and did some minimal treatment on it and returned it back for agriculture and for livestock. Now, to be fair, coal bed methane literally is the fresh water source for a lot of areas where those seams outcrop into the open atmosphere. So that's not unheard of to treat that water. And then up in the Northeast, up in the Marcellus, there's been a company up there that's literally been taking Marcellus shale produced water and driving it to salt and recovering fresh water back out of it and returning that back to the environment. Now, we'll talk about that more later on. A lot of those processes were very costly, is why they didn't just expand and start developing across the industry. But as we move out, the Barnett Shale was a new realm of opportunity for the industry. And that's where we made the turn from conventional oil and gas production into what is now referred to as unconventional oil and gas production.
Mike, can you talk us through what was happening in 2000 that started all sorts of different agencies and organizations to dig more into produced water?
So in early 2000 is when I think the real climate issues started hitting the state of New Mexico in the Southwest. For the last 20 years, we've been below average precipitation, I think 18 out of those 23 years, 19 out of those 23 years. So in early 2000, people were looking at this produced water as an alternative resource. It is a brackish water. We were doing a lot of desalination research for brackish aquifers within the state of New Mexico and in the Southwest. It seemed natural to look at produced water. That's when organizations like Los Alamos National Laboratories, Sandia National Laboratories, the Petroleum Recovery Research Center at New Mexico Tech, DOE, and EPA all started looking at treatment of produced water to supplement freshwater supplies and utilize treated produced water for applications like agriculture and things like that may not have to be treated to as high a quality. So the last 20 years, we have been moving forward. And most recently, in 2020, EPA has decided that wastewater reuse is going to be one of the major opportunities for produced water in the future. And therefore, they're looking at 5 major industry sectors. One of those is the oil and gas sector and produced water, because oil and gas is produced in about 35 states in the country. So they're really interested in looking at the treatment and encouraging the treatment and reuse of produced water to supplement water supplies across the U.S.
All right, Rick. So we heard a little bit of a mention about the Barnett Shale and the shale revolution. Can you take us deeper into unconventional reservoirs and the impact that it's having for the need of treated produced water and how that's playing into this situation?
Absolutely, Evan. So let me start out by making sure our audience has a fair understanding of the difference between a conventional and an unconventional reservoir. And I'm going to give you a very simple generic one that'll help visualize this. For a conventional reservoir, imagine a glass jar filled with sand. If you poured water in the top of that jar, you could literally watch that water move through the space between the sand grains and collect at the bottom. The ease at which that water comes through there is referred to in our industry as permeability. And when it moves that easily, that sand is said to have a great amount of permeability, normally referred to as Darcy permeability, but that's getting too deep in the weeds. On the contrary, for an unconventional reservoir, imagine the cement on the sidewalk. If you poured water on top of that cement, it wouldn't go anywhere. That's an unconventional reservoir. There's pore space there, but it's so microscopic and tiny and poorly connected that it's hard for the liquid to move through it. But if we could put thousands of little tiny cracks in that cement, it would allow that liquid to slowly migrate its way through that reservoir, through that rock. To make that happen in an unconventional reservoir and to make it successful and economical to go out and explore or exploit these reservoirs, what we had to learn to do is to turn the drill bit horizontal, go down several miles deep into the ground, find that formation, turn horizontal, and then drill out horizontal through it to open up as much of the area as we could, and then create those tiny little cracks to let that gas and or oil make its way into the wellbore and come to the surface. That's the difference between, in a conventional well, all we have to do is put a hole into the reservoir and it naturally flows in. In an unconventional, we have to help it by creating these fractures. The way we do that is through what's referred to as hydraulic horsepower. We take water with some additives with a lot of pressure and put it down hole, and it creates those little fractures, those cracks in that rock to allow it to flow out. The Barnett Shale was the first large-scale economic success for this type of completion activity, what's commonly referred to as high-rate, high-volume hydraulic fracturing. And that changed the scope of water usage in our operation. Dave mentioned earlier, the early fractures that were done in the late 40s were very small, maybe 10,000 gallons of water. As we now, if you imagine, if we turn this wellbore horizontally, and in the Barnett, they were initially drilling out 3,000, 4,000 feet, it took a larger volume of water to create those fractures. Today's modern hydraulic fracturing job, that horizontal section is stretching out 20,000 feet, if not longer. So now that's an even larger amount. Mike's talked quite a bit today about the drought impacts that we see in New Mexico and that we see in the Delaware Basin in Texas and the Midland Basin in Texas, and the common drought impacts. The industry is very cognizant of the fact of the amount of water that we typically use. And so for years, for the last good decade or so, the industry has moved toward reusing as much produced water as possible in place of fresh water in these hydraulic fracturing completions. That's what has really driven that part of the reuse consideration of the reuse focus, has been offsetting freshwater use in our operations. I mentioned earlier that in the early days of the Barnett, all the additives only worked with freshwater. Well, as time evolved, of course, we found new additives. We created similar chemistries that would work well in these salty brines, and that's what allowed us to do this.
So Mike, we know that New Mexico is not alone in these challenges around finding additional water sources. Can you talk about what other states in the Southwest are doing to solve this as well?
Sure. You're right. New Mexico is one of 9 states that currently are looking at standards associated with the treatment and reuse of produced water. We also have new states like Oklahoma and Texas that are also beginning to start groups and consortia looking at the treatment of produced water. As our interaction with the US EPA on the Water Reuse Action Plan on produced water, we are coordinating a cooperative coordinating council of states. We have 9 states represented that all have regulations and permitting requirements in place for the reuse of produced water. We're trying to coordinate that amongst all of the states, coordinate testing, coordinate research, and coordinating our regulatory postures such that we can have a consistent approach for treatment and reuse of produced water that is respective of public and environmental health and safety. So there's a number of states that are looking at this. We're trying to coordinate with them as we move forward.
All right, Rick, can you share with the audience a little bit more about some of the other factors and drivers that are playing into this situation? What's really driving the importance and the need for treated produced water reuse?
Okay, very good, Evan. And so obviously we just talked quite a bit about the large volumes of water that are being used. Well, we need to point out that while we're using those large volumes of water, of produced water, and we're treating these wells or completing these wells through hydraulic fracturing, once we're done completing them and we bring these wells on production, a lot of that water comes right back at us. And we have to do something. We either have to reuse it, treat it, and reuse it again, or in a lot of instances, we have to dispose of it. Typically, that disposal is done via deep well injection in what's referred to as Class 2 UIC or underground injection control wells. This is a regulated process, and we have a tremendous number of these wells in New Mexico and in the Texas portions of the Permian Basin. However, in the last several years, we've started to see some seismic events occur. And we've started to see where both New Mexico's Department of OCD as well as the Texas Railroad Commission are really focused on watching this seismicity. We've seen some what is referred to as some seismic response areas being identified. There's one just south of the New Mexico border in Culberson, Reeves County. There's one over by Midland, referred to as Gardendale, and then there's also one just to the east there, referred to as the Stanton area. And what I mean by this is we're seeing areas to where we're seeing an uptick in seismic events that are in particularly the magnitude 3 area and some in the magnitude 4 area, that the most common thought process now is these seismic events are tied to deep well injection of produced water. And so there's a lot of focus on this. And where are we going to put this water if we're unable to put it down these deep wells? Because putting it down the deep wells is one of the most cost-efficient ways of handling it if we're unable to reuse it. But if that deep well injection is not available, that causes an issue. The common average amount of water produced these days is 4 barrels of produced water for every 1 barrel of oil in the Permian Basin, whether you're in New Mexico or in Texas. And so imagine, if you will, if you've got a Class 2 UIC well that's permitted to receive 20,000 barrels of water a day, and the state decides to shut it in because they believe it's linked to seismic issues. If an operator cannot find somewhere to go with that water, that just shut in 5,000 barrels a day of oil production. And right now, that has a current revenue estimate to an operator of somewhere between $450,000 and $500,000 a day. So that becomes a great issue if all of a sudden if you have nowhere to reuse the water or nowhere to dispose of it. Your only other choice at that point in time is to shut in your production. So that's one of the things that are really impacting this. I've mentioned it a little bit before. I'll mention it again. The technology has been around for several years to treat this water to recover some volume of fresh water out of it, but it's been very expensive. But we're seeing that technology improve. We're seeing energy efficiency in that technology improve, and we're continually seeing that price point going down. And as it comes down and it gets closer to the cost of deep well injection, and keep in mind the cost of deep well injection and the risk associated with it is applied to that cost, is pushing that upward. So those 2 points are coming together. When we get to the point where, and there are some technologies out there now that if you can manage to get a hold of waste heat, that you can make these technologies work for about the cost of deep well injection in a lot of areas. So that's one of the key drivers that's moving us to this point to where in the near future, we could be to the point where we can actually economically recover fresh water from this produced water.
Let me kick in here with a point of view. It's not just oil and gas produced water that we're looking at. We're looking at actually trying to develop alternate water resources for a number of certain, even in New Mexico, potash mining and stuff like that. Their water needs to be treated. And remember, the Middle East, their water comes from desalination. So the technology to make a purer water is being driven by far more than just oil and gas. Dow, down here in my area around in Freeport, claims to use water 3 times in their advertising, i.e., so they have water and they make sure that they treat it and go to the next stage in the process of what they're making. I think we'll see that happen a lot more. New Mexico is unique in that it's an advanced culture, but it's also fairly sparsely populated. It is also really going to suffer from this drought and as climate change comes through.
Very interesting and very insightful. Thank you guys for running us through that. It's cool to see how multiple pieces and multiple aspects are pointing towards the importance and the need for treated produced water. Before we wrap up, I want to give it back to each of you guys to kind of leave the audience with some key points and some key takeaways. And I'll hand it over to Dave first.
Well, very gratifying to me personally to see everybody realize the importance of public perception. You're not going to be able to do this without the public, your neighbors, being for it.
All right, Rick, any key takeaways or final thoughts to leave the audience with?
Yeah, if I haven't said it strongly enough again, I want to really reiterate it that I've been passionate about looking at this for the last 15 years. I'm getting very excited because I can actually see the end post just over the horizon. And I know we're getting close. And I want the listeners to know that we are getting very close to the point with technology, with our ability to test this water and treated water to where we know we're going to economically and safely be able to recover some percentage of fresh water from produced water. So I'd like the audience to know that that could very possibly become a reality in the next several years. And I think it will be extremely beneficial to the drought-prone areas of New Mexico.
All right, Mike, and would you like to wrap us up?
Sure. I think this podcast kind of identifies the fact that the state of New Mexico really needs to look at additional water resources. our traditional freshwater resources have been impacted by climate change. I think we've shown the fact that a number of states are moving toward the use of treated produced water to supplement their supplies. I think Rick talked about the fact that the technology maturity and the cost of the technology is there today, that we can do this cost effectively. Our data from the consortium is that the quality data that we're looking for at the treatment is sufficient to meet current applications for different fit for purpose uses. And we're also seeing at a national level that the US EPA and the Department of Energy and the Bureau of Reclamation have all recognized that produced water can be treated, has opportunities to be used to supplement freshwater supplies around the country, and can become one element of a diversified portfolio of new water sources to support long-term natural resources security, water security, and energy security for the United States and states like New Mexico and Texas that have large resources of oil and gas. So thank you very much, guys. Appreciate it.
If I could, I wanted to add one final comment. I would like to say, number one, that the state of New Mexico should be very proud. They were the first state to stand up a produced water research consortium to focus on this. Other states are falling in line and doing the same thing now, but New Mexico was out ahead of everybody else. When I heard that New Mexico was standing it up, I was one of the first people on the phone saying, I want to be part of this. I want to help drive this forward. So I'm very proud of the consortium that's been stood up at New Mexico State University. Very proud of the leadership of Secretary Kinney in helping get this established, and very proud to be part of it. It's a wonderful group of a bunch of very talented individuals that have a common goal in mind.
Well, thank you, Mike and Rick and Dave. We really appreciate you all being with us today.
All right, that wraps us up for episode number 2. Join us next time for episode number 3, where we will dive deeper into treated produced water. Take a look at some of the treatment options and some of the details behind that treatment, as well as some of the potential use cases for treated produced water.